The movie opens with a man and a woman having fun while an older man gazes at them with a warm, affectionate smile. They kiss, laugh, and enjoy themselves, basking in a blissful moment free from concerns or worries. The man's name's Dan. He's a young poet who fell in love with a beautiful girl named Candy. Dan doesn't have many prospects in life. He was abandoned by his family when he was younger and, as a result, he has struggled with addiction ever since. While Dan and Candy have fun, he describes the moment he fell in love with her, how his life became brighter. Their relationship is separated into 3 stages. The first one, Dan calls heaven. It starts from the moment he met Candy and the early stages of their relationship. Candy is different from Dan, though they both have deep scars that they try to hide no matter what. She comes from a middle-class family with loving parents. Before she met Dan, she went to art school and she loved painting. Candy thinks Dan is her soulmate, recognizing a deep connection between them. Dan loves and admires her art, and he worships her as if she is a masterpiece. It was also Dan who introduced Candy to substances, and she quickly became addicted to them. One day, while they are using substances, Candy overdoses. Dan is with her, holding her hand while she relaxes in the bathtub. After some minutes, he notices that she isn't responding, and he tries waking her up. It takes him a long time to bring Candy back. When Candy wakes up, she's lethargic and slow. Instead of being upset or even afraid of the overdose she just suffered, she enjoyed the experience. Dan continues to narrate the story by saying that he never meant to ruin Candy's life. He saw a pretty girl, smart and fun to be with, and it made him feel better about himself. He confesses to being selfish. With Candy, his future didn't seem so bleak or lonely anymore. He wanted to hold her forever. Dan has a close friend named Casper who helps him feed his addiction. Casper is the old man from the beginning. He's a chemistry professor and has access to many substances from his classes. Dan and Candy go to his place to ask for money and he happily gives it to them. Dan promises he's going to pay back, though Casper has no hope that he will. Still, he likes Dan enough to help him out. Right after they leave Casper's place, they buy substances and get high while in a car wash. The trip is fast and when they crash, they get sleepy and lethargic. Later on, they go to Candy's parents' house to have dinner, trying to pretend they are fine. Candy's father, Jim, is a nice man, albeit a bit clueless. As for Elaine, she despises Dan with all her heart because of Candy's addiction. They don't talk about it in the open, but her parents know she's using substances. They can see it in their faces and the way they are living life. Elaine tries to hold her tongue about Candy. They don't have a great relationship because Elaine criticizes Candy all the time. Candy doesn't like visiting her parents, and the only reason she's there with Dan is because they need money. While Candy stays with her mother in the kitchen, Dan talks to Jim about getting married to Candy. He asks Jim for a loan because he doesn't have any money, and Jim lends him some. Dan promises to pay him back, though, like Casper, it's an empty promise. Candy and Elaine argue and Candy storms out of the house, stealing some money from her parents on her way. They start stealing more from stores, neighbors, and people close to them to buy more substances. Their addiction is so bad that they can't go a day without using something. When things get tough, Candy decides to try and sell her art kit and a ring from her grandma. The owner of the pawning store doesn't offer a lot of money, so Candy sells her body instead. Dan doesn't know how to feel about that. He knows it's wrong, that she shouldn't be doing that, but at the same time, if they don't have money, they can't get high. Dan's selfishness prevents him from criticizing Candy for her choices. When she comes back, not even winded, Dan weakly apologizes to her. Candy doesn't care about his platitudes and brushes him off. They go home, get high and read poetry in bed. Dan looks at Candy in a moment of silence and asks if she's going to marry him. She smiles, agreeing to be his wife. They get married a few days later, in a courthouse. Candy is wearing a black lace dress, much to Elaine's chagrin, and Dan is a bit fussed up. They don't care about appearances. They are happy. After the wedding, they go to Candy's parents' house to celebrate. There, Dan gets high to the point that he almost falls asleep in the middle of a conversation. Elaine tries to talk to Candy about it, but she dodges the talk and leaves. After the party, they go to McDonald's to eat burgers and fries. Candy tells Dan that she thinks they should stop using substances now that they are married. Dan agrees, though deep down they know they won't stop. Dan narrates that they found each other in a world of pain and hardships. Their relationship was sacred. They could be whoever they wanted to be with each other. It was perfect until it wasn't. The second stage of the relationship Dan narrates is Earth. The first stage was about affectionate gestures, shared laughter, and heartfelt conversations. They were still getting to know each other and learning how to be in a relationship. In the second stage, it's time for the ugly parts, the ones that appear only after years together. The passion is not enough to hold the couple together anymore. They need more. Their lives are led by their addiction, and they have to find ways to feed it. Candy starts working as a courtesan, selling her pay for their addiction. Dan doesn't do anything to help. They stay in the back of a garage, in a dingy flat they can barely afford. The place is a mess. Candy starts resenting Dan for doing nothing, calling him weak and useless. She gets angrier when he uses the substances without her, and they get into an argument. Candy slaps Dan in her anger, saying that he's a waste of space. She blames him for being addicted and for the way her life is ruined. She can't paint anymore, her mind is a jumbled mess and she's tired. Every day she humiliates herself to pay for their addiction. Dan feels bad and says that they can stop using, that she doesn't need to sell herself anymore. Candy thinks he's ridiculous for thinking they can quit. She points out that it's about time he earns some money, suggesting that he starts selling his. Their relationship quickly spirals after that. They constantly fight, but then they make up and get intimate. It's a toxic relationship where both are emotionally dependent. Candy can't see a way out of addiction and Dan doesn't want to. He's used to that life, and he feels as if he can't go back to normal. Getting high is a way of forgetting their issues, of having a brief reprieve from their problems. The reprieve costs a lot of money, and Dan has to find a way for Candy to stop selling her. He thinks about selling his, she suggested, but when it's time, he gives up. He steals a wallet instead. With the wallet, Dan comes up with a plan to take all the money from the owner. With Casper's help, Dan goes to the bank pretending to be the owner and withdraws the money from the account. It's a clean and smart plan, and soon he has thousands of dollars on his hands. He gets home bursting with happiness. Candy doesn't look as happy, she looks worried. She tells Dan that she's pregnant, and that throws a wrench in Dan's plans. She thinks about terminating the pregnancy, knowing that it won't be easy since they are addicts. Dan, who never had a close family, wants to have the baby. He wants to have a family with Candy, even if it means they need to get clean. Later on, they go to Candy's parents' house to tell them the good news. Elaine cries silently, not believing that her daughter was going to have a baby. She knows Candy is an addict, and she's worried about it. In turn, Jim is very happy. He feels hopeful that the baby will be what Candy and Dan need to fix their lives. He hugs Candy tightly and starts crying. Candy feels the rush of emotions, the responsibility, and how miserable her life is. She starts crying too, holding her father tightly. As Dan watches, he feels uncomfortable with the cries. Deep down, he is guilty of endorsing Candy's addiction. He knows the tears Jim and Elaine are shedding aren't only of happiness for their daughter. They are crying because they are sad that their daughter was lost. A few months go by and Candy is already with a baby bump. In the past few months, they continued using a even with the pregnancy. It's only when Candy is already showing that they decide to get clean. They move into a new apartment and get ready for their homemade rehab. They buy wine, medicine for pain, and some food to help them out. They make Casper promise not to give them any substances, even if they beg. For the next few days, as the substances leave their body, they suffer a lot. It's not easy to do it without help from a professional. On the fourth day, Candy can't bear it anymore and starts calling everyone looking for money. Dan grabs the phone from her and she has a nervous breakdown. Dan tries to calm her down and comfort her, but it's pointless. After struggling and screaming a lot, Dan notices that Candy is bleeding. He nervously brings her to a hospital and she goes into a very early labor. They lose their baby. Dan feels as if his world is falling apart. Candy is depressed and can't stop crying. They try comforting each other, but they are empty shells at that point. Losing their baby only opened their wounds again and destroyed any progress they had made. This is the last stage of their relationship, and Dan calls it hell. They go back to using substances and Candy starts selling her again. Dan notices that she's spiraling and decides it might be a good idea for them to move. Go away from the cities where they buy substances as easily as they can breathe. They move to an old, dingy house in the countryside. The house is falling to pieces and they have no skills to take care of themselves. Dan is hopeful that they will finally move on from the pain and grief, but Candy is apathetic. She's devoid of any spark or vitality. Things take a worse turn for her when her parents visit. At first, they are polite and try to pretend they aren't worried about Candy's living situation. Elaine soon freaks out about their inability to take care of themselves. She's tired of watching Candy slowly lose her life, and all because of Dan. She gets into an argument with Candy and Candy snaps. She angrily yells at her mother that she always had issues. Dan isn't to blame for all her misgivings in life. She mostly blames her parents for them. Elaine and Jim leave soon after her breakdown and Dan comforts her. In a moment of peace and quiet, she confesses to him that she doesn't think they will be together for much longer. Dan disagrees, but he has no idea what is going through Candy's mind. She's tired and carrying the weight of guilt on her shoulders. She resents Dan and her parents, but above all, she hates herself. Their relationship gets worse. Dan finds a job and tries harder to take care of Candy. Meanwhile, staying alone at the house, lost in her thoughts, makes Candy resent Dan even more. She starts mirroring the hatred she feels for herself toward him. It gets to a point where she can barely look at his face without feeling angry. One day, when Dan comes back home after work, he finds Candy with another man. She's high and laughing with the strange man. She doesn't care how Dan feels about her being alone with another man. After all, she already cheated on him plenty of times. She wants to hurt him, to push him away from her. When Dan asks what is going on between them, she tells him to take a hike. Dan waits for her to come back home and ends up falling asleep. Candy comes back only hours later, and when Dan asks where she was and what she was doing, she denies answering him. She looks distraught. He knows there's something wrong with her, but she's too bitter to tell him. When he insists, she tauntingly starts drawing on the walls of their house, bad-mouthing her mother and Dan. She calls Dan weak and spineless. Dan tries not to get upset with this version of Candy. After all, he helped turn her into that. He understands her pain, her suffering, so he leaves her alone. He goes to work in the morning and Candy stays home by herself. While she's frantically grabbing everything she needs to paint on the walls, she accidentally stares at the mirror. The image she sees makes her hurt even more. She can't recognize herself anymore. She looks terrible, with dark circles around her empty eyes. Her hair is limp and oily. She's thin and sickly looking. As she stares, the only thing she can think about is how she hates Dan for turning her into that shell. She knows the blame doesn't lie all in him, but all she can think about is that he took advantage of her. Out of his selfishness, he turned her into the shell of a girl. Candy starts spiraling, and the only way for her to calm herself down is through painting. She starts writing her story with Dan on the walls, blaming him for ruining her life. She wants him to hurt, to feel guilty, to stop smiling at her. When Dan comes back later on, bringing some flowers he picked for her, he's shocked at the state of the house. Everything is a mess. The walls still have fresh paint on them, and the things she wrote cut him deeply. She talks about the beginning of their relationship. Her vision is very similar to Dan's. She describes how they couldn't keep their hands off of each other. When she met him, it was love at first sight. He was as addicting as the substances they used, and just like them, whenever she was sober, she wondered if it was worth it. She talks about the baby they lost, a boy they named Thomas, and that she can still hear the sounds of his heart pounding. Reading everything she wrote is too much for Dan. During his relationship with her, he always pushed his guilt aside, trying not to think too much about it. He pretended he wasn't the one to lead her to that path, making her captive like he was. He can't pretend anymore. He's tired, too. He goes to Casper's house after that, desperate to forget the pain he caused the person he loved the most. Dan had been clean for some time, and all his progress went down the drain for a moment of peace. Casper partakes with him, sharing his pain and pleasure. Meanwhile, Candy comes back home and sees his note telling her where he was. She spends the whole night alone at the house, silently having a nervous breakdown. The next day, someone calls Casper's house looking for Dan. He picks up the phone and finds out Candy is in rehab. She asked for help after falling apart. Dan's lethargic and looks tired when he meets with Candy's parents. They don't mention his appearance. He finds Candy staring blankly at nowhere, wearing a dark blue sweatshirt. She looks so small and wiped off that Dan feels his heart breaking all over again. He did that to her. Candy tells him that she was frightened and confused. Dan apologizes to her, but it's pointless. Candy is completely out of it. She's severely depressed and in need of medical help. There's nothing Dan can do to help her, and he finally understands that. When he is leaving, he meets Jim outside the hospital. He hugs Dan tight and whispers in his ear that no matter what Candy needs, Dan can give it to her. He only wants her to be happy. Dan can't believe Jim is telling him that. He shakes his head and storms off, taking his last steps away from Candy. He goes back to Casper's house and finds his friend passed away. He had an overdose. Dan doesn't express any emotions. He's numb. He closes Casper's eyes and sits next to him, hugging himself as if that will hold all his feelings inside. He is now completely alone in the world. He destroyed the best thing that ever happened to him, all because he was too selfish to choose between his addiction and the woman he loved. His addiction owns in the end, and it left nothing behind for him, only heartbreak. Days go by and Dan starts slowly getting his life back together. He still thinks about Candy constantly. He loves her. He also learned that love is about letting people go too. He knows Candy needs to find her way without him. They are like fire and gasoline, and only destruction comes out of their union. He wants her to be happy, to go back to painting, get her life on track again, and become the daughter her parents deserve. If he's with her, he will hinder her. Dan's self-hatred runs deep too. He feels worthless and abandoned. At least, he managed to stay clean after Casper's passing away. He started working at a Chinese restaurant, and though things look bleak, he's not hopeless. One day, Candy goes to the restaurant to visit him, but he doesn't want to see her. His coworker insists and he has no other option but to meet her. When he sees her, his heart breaks all over again. She looks beautiful and healthy. Her golden hair is shining and her blue eyes aren't filled with pain anymore. Her smile is what hurts the most because it's just like it was when they met for the first time. At that moment, Dan realizes that they could never be together again. Candy deserved better. Candy looks happy seeing him again. They make small talk and then she kisses him. He can't push her away. Her kiss is both a bomb and a curse. It takes him back to the beginning when they were very happy. It also reminds him of all the pain that came after. When they separate, he tries to hold back his tears of regret. Candy looks confused at his distance. He starts crying and tells her there's no going back for them. Their relationship is over, just like she said it would be one day. He softly tells her that they found their reprieve in each other, but it didn't work out. Candy is surprised that he wants to end things with her. She thought they would go back together, but Dan isn't willing to risk it. They stare at each other with eyes full of sadness and longing. Candy is hurt at his rejection, but deep down she understands. They are too hurt and traumatized to go back to the start. They need to let go. Dan watches her leave without a word. Then, he's alone.